What if your spiritual awakening isn't the happy ending they promised? What if, instead of feeling more alive, you start to feel emptier, more confused, more distant from everything? What if, upon waking up, you realize that everything that used to drive you has simply faded away? Why does everything lose its meaning after spiritual awakening? You had that moment, a breakdown, a revelation, a clear feeling that something inside you had awakened. And for a while, everything made sense. But then, without warning, came the silence, and with it, doubt. Why is it that now, when I finally see the truth, everything feels so meaningless? At some point on your spiritual path, maybe after a deep insight or a breakdown you couldn't explain, you felt it. Something inside you shifted. You saw through the illusion, the endless patterns, the noise of the world, and then the silence. At first, this awareness was intense, almost liberating, as if finally you had awakened to truth. But over time, that feeling began to fade, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, as if your soul had turned down the volume of life and forgot to turn it back up. You stopped chasing things. You stopped caring, not because you were indifferent, but because of a silent exhaustion that settled deep into your bones. And then, a new question began to whisper in the back of your mind. Why do I feel so empty now that I've finally awakened? This is where many get lost, because there's a real, rarely discussed paradox. We expect spiritual awakening to ignite our passion for life, to fill us with meaning. But for many, especially the sensitive, the introspective, the sincere seekers, it does the opposite. It empties. I remember an aunt of mine. She was deeply devoted to the spiritual path. After one intense night, she had what she called a true awakening. She said, "I saw through the illusion, the ego, identity, the endless need for validation. Everything just fell apart." But 2 months later, she was apathetic, paralyzed, barely able to get out of bed, and she confided in me. "Before I suffered because I wasn't productive enough. Now, I don't care if I do something or nothing. I thought awakening would illuminate me, but it just silenced me." This experience is not uncommon. And here's where Carl Jung comes in, the father of analytical psychology. Jung didn't use modern spiritual terms, but he deeply understood what happens when the unconscious begins to emerge. He said, "Enlightenment does not happen by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Though this phrase sounds beautiful, its truth is harsh. Awakening is not the end of the journey. It is the beginning of a death. A symbolic death of the ego, identity, the structures that once gave meaning to your life, goals, social roles, career, even time. This collapse can feel devastating. But Jung would explain the ego hasn't disappeared. It has just lost its map. Without a new path, motivation vanishes. And what arises is a void, a limbo. You're not clinically depressed. You're between worlds. You've awakened from an illusion, but you haven't yet awakened to what comes next. And that's where many get confused. In the modern world, which worships productivity and instant happiness, this space is seen as failure. But Jung saw something very different. This emptiness isn't a mistake. It's sacred. It's the pause that comes before individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are. But nobody talks about this part, do they? No, this quiet, unsettling phase of spiritual awakening, where everything seems meaningless, rarely gets discussed in spiritual circles. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about now. What really happens in your psyche after awakening? And why this apparent loss of motivation can actually be the greatest spiritual leap of your life, if you face it honestly. Before we continue, a quick invitation. If you enjoy expanding your consciousness and exploring the deeper layers of existence, subscribe here to Fragments of the Soul. This channel exists to make the invisible visible, to support those navigating this strange, challenging, and at the same time, deeply sacred path of awakening. If you're in that foggy state, floating in what they call post-awakening, wondering where your spark went, know this: you're not alone, and you're definitely not crazy. What you're going through is a transformation so deep that it doesn't just change your thoughts. It rewires your internal operating system. What once drove you now, goals, checklists, career plans, motivational videos about productivity, no longer works the same way. Not because you're sabotaging yourself, but because something fundamental is collapsing. Your old motivation system is breaking down. And yes, Carl Jung was already talking about this long before spiritual awakening became viral content. Let's understand this better. For most of our lives, our motivation comes from a very specific place, the egocentric identity, the I we believe ourselves to be. You want to be seen, admired, feel enough, be loved. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's the beginning of the human journey. Jung called this social construct the persona, the mask we wear to function in the world. But awakening removes that mask, and suddenly you see the game. And once you see it, you can't play anymore. Validation no longer tastes the same. Success feels hollow. You don't want to be someone anymore because you no longer believe someone needs to be made. And that's where it all gets complicated. Without the mask, your old goals lose their meaning. They were created by a you that no longer exists. It's like you're an actor who's left the stage, but still hears the applause and no longer knows the role. That's what makes you feel unmotivated. You haven't lost your strength, you've just outgrown the old fuel. This loss of motivation is not failure, it's a sign that something new is being born, and that the drive now won't come from seeking recognition, but from something much deeper. Carl Jung believed we are not here to deny the ego, but to integrate it, not to eliminate it, but to align it with something greater. He called this process individuation, the journey of transforming a fragmented self, trapped behind masks, into a more authentic, whole, and unified inner center. Not the self that seeks approval, status, or control, but the self, that deep core of the soul, connected to the whole. And the self does not move by ambition or rational clarity. It exists to express truth. So when awakening happens, your psyche begins to reorganize. It rejects everything false, forced, and fabricated, everything that came from the ego. And that includes relationships, ambitions, your current job, and even that beautifully drawn dream board from 2023. That's why so many describe awakening as something liberating and, at the same time, disorienting. You lose your ground because the old ground was an illusion, but Jung warned us, If you stop here, you will be stuck. Many awaken, then fall into denial. They get caught in the trap of spiritual alienation. They start to believe nothing matters anymore, that everything is an illusion. And with that, they withdraw from life. They numb themselves. They fade away. They confuse detachment with disengagement, but the self wants something completely different. It wants to live through you, to bring the invisible into the body. It doesn't reject the world. It redefines your place in it. But for this to happen, you must go through a strange and invisible phase, a little recognized territory, almost never talked about, the in-between phase. It's not pretty on Instagram. It doesn't get 1,000 likes. It's not about meditating on a mountaintop or writing enlightened quotes at sunset. In reality, it looks like this, sitting in silence, unsure what to say, while the world rushes by outside. Carl Jung would call this the middle. You're no longer the ego, but you haven't yet learned to live from the self. And this space, uncomfortable as it may feel, is not a mistake. It's a rite of passage. But modern culture doesn't recognize this. We live in a culture where pause becomes diagnosis. Silence is mistaken for laziness, introspection for weakness. So you judge yourself, and that judgment blocks exactly what the soul is trying to recover, the vital energy buried under years of conditioning. Jung had a name for this swinging between extremes, enantiodromia, the movement where something transforms into its opposite. In awakening, the inner pendulum swings from ego effort to soul stillness. You go from "I have to do everything" to "why do anything at all?" And this swing is necessary, it's sacred. This is how balance is restored. In ancient myths, this is the hermit's moment. It's death before rebirth. It's the phase where the caterpillar becomes mush inside the cocoon, not yet a butterfly. No longer an insect, just is. And yes, mush achieves nothing. It does not rush, it dissolves. At this point, the ego panics. It wants urgency, control, direction. But the self whispers, "Let go. I'm building something deeper." And here, once again, modern spirituality stumbles. It ignores this part. It says, "Follow your joy. Positive vibes only." But Jung would be clear. If you skip the darkness, you skip the gold. The integration of the shadow, facing the most uncomfortable and repressed parts of yourself, is not a bonus. It's the soul's required curriculum. That emptiness you feel today is not the end. It's where the unconscious finally finds space to emerge. You are not failing. You are metabolizing, and your psyche knows exactly what it's doing. It will block your motivation, your drive, even your clarity, all on purpose to force you to feel, observe, and reclaim lost parts of yourself. This is the real work, and here comes the most beautiful turning point. When you stop resisting the void, something new begins to arise. Motivation returns, but it's different. It's not anxiety. It's not pressure. It's not performance. It's something older, quieter, a will that comes from the soul. It feels more like remembering than seeking. Carl Jung called this the emergence of the self, not as an idea, but as a living inner compass. You walked through the void, felt the pause, the silence, the dissolution. And now, something begins to stir, not a lightning bolt, not fireworks, but a silent tug. And it's not to go back to what was, it's to create something new. But the self's call is not to return to the old, it's to build something new. And the self doesn't speak in ready-made phrases. It shows up as nudges, subtle synchronicities, what Jung called symbolic life. Carl Jung believed that when the ego surrenders and the unconscious is integrated, we become finally able to live from a place deeper than personality. That's when life stops being about survival and starts being about meaning. And here's the surprise. This meaning is rarely grandiose. Actually, it's often wonderfully ordinary. When the self leads, you don't live in a rush. You respond. You're not driven by fear of falling behind, but by what resonates with your soul. You don't chase clarity. You recognize it when it arrives. Living from the self doesn't mean feeling motivated all the time. There will still be days of tiredness, confusion, sadness. That's being human. But one thing changes forever. That constant feeling of inner betrayal disappears. That dragging yourself through a life that no longer makes sense is left behind. In its place, small signs of truth arise. You start creating, even when no one's watching. You learn to say no to what doesn't resonate, even if it looks promising on paper. You swap the to-do list for genuine curiosity. You swap performance for inner peace. This is the new fuel. It's not adrenaline, it's alignment. Jung called this living symbolically, not in a fanciful way, but with soul. Believing in dreams, inner images, gut feelings, as real guidance from a wiser place within you. Practically, this can be as simple as asking new questions. Instead of, "What should I do?" ask, "What is calling me?" Instead of, "What's the plan?" ask, "Where is life nudging me?" Instead of, "How do I prove myself?" ask, "What feels honest to me?" You stop trying to control life and start participating in it. And this doesn't mean giving up ambition. It means transforming it. Ambition stops being pressure. It becomes devotion to truth, presence, growth. The irony, this kind of energy accomplishes far more than the ego ever could, but now it's sustainable, now it's soul-driven. This is the new motivation, not to impress, but to express. And that's what naturally leads you to create, serve, heal, teach, build, not because you have to, but because your whole being says yes. So if you felt your spark dim after awakening, maybe the fire that went out was the old one, the one that burned from fear, validation, performance, and maybe now a deeper flame is being born, one that doesn't go out when the winds of life blow. Carl Jung never promised it would be easy, but if you're here, listening to this, it means you've already begun. It's not about reclaiming your old motivation. It's about discovering a new one, rooted in wholeness, not performance. This is not the end of your awakening. It's the beginning of your blossoming. If this message touched you, leave a comment. Share your experience. Maybe it will help another silent traveler. And if you want to keep journeying with us, subscribe here to Fragments of the Soul. Because awakening isn't the end of the story. It's where the real story begins.